Now we will discuss about the evaporation. The process of conversion of liquid into its vapor is called evaporation. The process of conversion of liquid into its vapors is known as or is called evaporation. And evaporation can be used for separation. You can say that it can be used for separation. So it is another technique of separation. We can take an example. Salt can be separated from seawater by evaporation. Salt from seawater can be separated by evaporation. For separation of salt from seawater, firstly we take a dish. Suppose this is a dish. In this dish we use seawater. We fill this dish with seawater. These are the particles of seawater. As we know, seawater contains salt. Suppose these are the small particles of salt. These white particle is of salt. So we can say that the white particles are of salt. These are salt particles, and these blue particle is of water. These are water particles. So in seawater, water and salt particles are mixed together. Now we heat this dish, and when we heat dish, the water from dish will evaporate. Water from dish will evaporate. So we can say that water begin to evaporate just like this. This is the particle of water which has been evaporated. That is vapors or water vapor. And the salt particles which are soluble in water begin to collect with each other or attract particles with each other. After some time we observe that disc will contain only particles of salt. These are the particles of salt, and these particles collect with each other and forms a crystal just like this. These are the small particles of salt and collect with each other and forms a crystal of salt. So we can say that after some time we get the crystals of salt. These are the crystals of salt, and water has been evaporated. Here the particle size of salt is too small, so we can't observe it by naked eyes. But here the particle size or the crystal size of salt, that is a crystal of salt which is very big, or we can say that it is very bigger than these small particles, so we can observe it. So after heating we get crystals of salt and water has been evaporated. So this process is known as evaporation, because in this process water convert into water vapors, and conversion of water into water vapor is known as evaporation. After evaporation we get crystals of salt. So we can say that by this method we can get salt from seawater. Now we will discuss the use of more than one method of separation. Use of more than one method of separation. In this topic we will discuss the use of more than one method of separation simultaneously. So firstly we discuss use of filtration and evaporation. In this method, firstly we use filtration and then we use evaporation. Firstly we take a example. Suppose we need to separate components of mixture of sand and salt. We need to separate components of mixture of sand and salt. So we can say that there is a need to separate sand and salt from their mixture. In this method, firstly we dissolve a mixture into a step Firstly, we dissolve a mixture into we take a container full of water. So firstly we fill this container with, these are the particles of water. Now we have completed the jar from water, and we take another beaker, that is another beaker which contain mixture of salt and sand. Suppose these are the particles of or crystals of salt, and these are the particles of sand. So we can say that in this representation, brown particle is of sand and the white particles is of salt. Now we add the material of this container into this container. This container is full of water. These are the particles of water. And when we add the material of this container into this container, we observe that the particles of sand which are insoluble in water will settle down and collect into the bottom side. So we can say these are the particle of sand which will be collected at bottom side of the container, because the particles of sand are insoluble in water, but the particles of salt is soluble in water, so they will be dissolved in water. Or we can say that the big crystals of salt is break into very small particles, and we can say that the salt has been dissolved, because the particle size before dissolution is of order of millimeter. Some millimeter we can say that 0.1 or 0.2 millimeter. So we can observe 0.1 or 0.2 millimeter particles from naked eyes easily. But after dissolution, the particle size of salt become convert into angstrom, and one angstrom is equal to 10⁻⁻10 meter, which is too short for visualization. So we can say that this is we can't observe these particle of salt from naked eyes or any microscope. So we can say that after the dissolution, salt particles will disappear. So we can say that the salt has been dissolved. So after dissolution of this total mixture into this beaker, we observe that the sand particles collected into the bottom side, and the particles of salt will disappear because their size will convert into angstrom. Or we can say that these particles or these crystals of salt which is of order of millimeter, or we can say that 10⁻⁻³ meter, this particle can be observed by naked eyes. So we observe the crystals of salt before dissolution, but after dissolution the particle size of salt become too small, so we can't observe these particles, and we can say that salt has been dissolved. Now first step to separate the sand from this mixture. As we know, the particle size of sand is very big, so we can use filtration process to separate these particles. So now we filter the solution. Now here we use the filtration step. As we know, in filtration step we use filter paper or a cone of filter paper, just like this. This is a cone of filter paper and it is porous, but the pore size of filter paper is too small, so sand particles cannot pass through this filter paper, but the solution of salt can pass through this filter paper easily. So we can say that in this filter paper the pore size is too small. So now we use a cone. Suppose this is a funnel. And we put this filter paper on funnel. So after putting filter paper on funnel, we observe that the structure will be like this is a funnel, and now we add the filter paper into this funnel, just like this is a filter paper, and filter paper is made up of porous substance, or we can say that here is a pores between the particles of filter paper. Now we add the solution here, we add the solution, and we use container here to collect the solution of salt. Here is a container. Now we add the solution of salt and sand, and we observe that the particle of sand are very big, so they cannot pass through from this filter paper and they will be collect here. So we observe that the particles of sand will collect in filter paper, but the solution of salt has very small particles, so they will pass through from the filter paper. Suppose this is a solution of salt and it will be passed through from the solution, and we will collect this salt solution here. So after some time we observe that the solution of salt will collect into the container, and also the particles of salt which is too small to observe were also present in this solution. These are the small particle of salt which we cannot observe from naked eye. So we can say that the salt solution will come into the container and the particles of sand will collect into the filter paper. So after some time we get filter paper full of sand particles. So after some time we observe that the filter paper or a cone of filter paper will collect sand particles. So we firstly detach this filter paper from the funnel and get these particles of sand, and now we dry the filter paper or this arrangement, and we observe or we get the dry particles of sand. So we put this filter paper into the oven for drying, and after drying we get the particles of sand. So now sand has been separated from the solution, but here salt particles present into the water. So this is a salt solution. In this solution there are two components present. First one is water and second one is salt. So there is a need to separate salt from solution. Now we apply second step, that is evaporation. That is another technique of separation. So now we use this container that is full of salt solution. It's a container that is full of salt solution. In this solution these are the particles of water, and some particles of salt will be present here, but we can't observe these particles because they are very small in size, or we can say that they are of order of angstrom. So we can't observe these small particles. So we observe a transparent solution in which salt particles also present. Now we heat this solution, and after heating we observe that the water convert into vapor. So after some time we observe that the level of water become lower and the water convert into vapors, just like this. These are the vapors of water or the water vapor, and the solution become concentrated, or we can say that the small particles of salt become too closer and try to attach with each other. These are the particles of salt and they are trying to attach with each other, and after some time whole of the water get evaporated, and we observe that container will contain only the particles of salt, and we observe that these salt particles become attached with each other and form the crystals of salt. Many of particles of salt become collect with each other and forms a crystal of salt, just like this. Now we can observe these particles. So these are the crystals of salt. So we can observe these particles because they are of order of 10⁻³ meter, or we can say that millimeter. So now the particles of salt has been separated from water vapor, and this process is known as evaporation. So we can say that in this whole method we use two method of separation. First one is filtration, in order to separate sand particles from solution of salt, and the second method which we are using, that is evaporation, in order to separate salt particles from water. So this is the method in which we use two methods of separation. First one is filtration and second one is evaporation. And after this process we observe that there is a particles of sand which has been separated, and this is the particles of salt which has been separated from the mixture.